In an era defined by change, one man stood out for his unique and unexpected persona. Tiny Tim, with his signature ukulele and distinctive falsetto, quickly captivated audiences around the world. His story blends mystery, spectacle, and an unshakable passion for music. From his modest beginnings in New York City to his rise as a cultural phenomenon, Tiny Tim's journey to fame was as strange as it was memorable. But as fast as he rose to stardom, his career began to unravel, leaving behind a legacy marked by controversy, oddity, and creative brilliance. In this video, we explore the extraordinary life of Tiny Tim. His rise, his eccentricities, and the music that continues to reverberate through pop culture. Join us as we delve into the life of the man who brought forgotten tunes back to life and forever changed the world of entertainment. Herbert Tiny Tim Brosgore was born on April 12, 1932, in the vibrant neighborhood of Washington Heights, New York City. His parents were immigrants, his father Lebanese and his mother Polish-Jewish, which meant Tiny Tim was immersed in a world of rich cultural diversity from the start. His upbringing in such a melting pot of people and traditions played a significant role in shaping the man he would become. Despite the bustle of the city, his world was often quiet and solitary, focused on a single obsession: music. While many children of his time were playing outside, Herbert was entranced by the sounds that filled his home, marking the beginning of his lifelong love affair with melody. Music was more than just a pastime for Herbert. It was his escape. At a young age, he became fascinated with phonograph records, spending hours listening to whatever he could get his hands on. One day, a 78 RPM record of Beautiful Ohio by Henry Burr changed everything for him. This single piece of music ignited a passion that would never fade. He would play the record over and over again, captivated not just by the melody, but by the world it opened up to him. This was his introduction to a bygone era, one he would soon become obsessed with: the music of the early 1900s. At just 6 years old, Herbert picked up his first guitar, teaching himself to play. He wasn't interested in the popular music of his time. Instead, he was drawn to the forgotten songs of the past. The music from a world long gone fascinated him more than anything else. His love for music wasn't just a passing interest. It was a force that would shape his life. By his early teens, he was already delving into the world of 1920s and 1930s music, learning about the great singers of that era, their styles, and their voices. But it wasn't just about playing instruments. Around the time he was a teenager, Herbert discovered something that would set him apart from his peers: a unique voice. It was while listening to radio personality Arthur Godfrey played the ukulele that he found his calling. The soft, delicate sound of the ukulele spoke to him, and soon it became his defining instrument. It was simple, yet full of charm, and it felt like a perfect match for his voice. The ukulele became an extension of his personality, quaint, unusual, and unlike anything most people were familiar with at the time. Herbert's voice also began to evolve during these formative years. He experimented with singing in a high falsetto, a vocal style he would later become known for. Though it felt strange at first, the more he practiced, the more he realized that it wasn't just a technique, it was his true voice. He would later describe this discovery as a religious experience. To him, it wasn't merely a musical choice, it was an identity. His falsetto was something special, something that set him apart in a world that didn't quite know what to make of him. As his teenage years wore on, his fascination with early 20th century music deepened. He would spend hours at the New York Public Library, poring over old phonograph records, sheet music, and books about the great artists and songs of the past. His love for music wasn't just about enjoyment, it was about understanding it. By the time he was in high school, he had a knowledge of music that surpassed many music historians, and he knew far more about the songs of the early 1900s than most of his teachers. But his academic life didn't reflect this passion. Herbert was never particularly interested in school. He struggled with traditional subjects like math and science, and his focus remained firmly on music. Despite his lack of interest in academics, Herbert's musical obsession flourished. He tried to balance school with his love for music, but eventually, his passion won out. He failed his sophomore year multiple times and eventually dropped out. His parents were concerned about his future, but by that time, Herbert had already made up his mind. He would support himself through odd jobs, but music would always be his priority. It wasn't just a career for him, it was his lifeblood. Around this time, Herbert began experimenting with his stage persona. He realized that his birth name, Herbert Broscore, wasn't particularly memorable. So, he began performing under various aliases, hoping one would stick. He tried names like Larry Love, Derry Doe, and Sir Timothy Timmins, but none of them felt right. Then, in 1960, his manager suggested a name that would define his career: Tiny Tim. The name was simple yet ironic, a reference to the fragile yet hopeful character from A Christmas Carol. It didn't seem like an obvious choice for someone who stood 6 feet 1 inch, but it worked. The name encapsulated his quirky, larger-than-life persona, and it became synonymous with his music. With his new stage name, Tiny Tim began to embrace a new image. He grew his hair long, a bold choice for the 1950s, and dressed in bright, eccentric clothing that made him look as though he had stepped out of a different time. He powdered his face white, believing it symbolized purity and youth. Tiny Tim wasn't just a musician, he was a character, a walking, talking piece of performance art. His voice, his look, and his unusual choices set him apart in a world that was beginning to embrace individuality. At 6 feet 1 inch, Tiny Tim towered over most of his peers, and his odd combination of eccentricities and talents made him an outlier. His voice, a combination of falsetto and baritone, gave him a sound that was impossible to ignore. By the time he was ready to step into the public eye, Tiny Tim wasn't just a musician. He was a full-fledged performer, an enigma in the truest sense of the word. As his identity solidified, so did his musical style. Tiny Tim was drawn to the old Tin Pan Alley songs, vaudeville tunes, and jazz standards from the early 1900s, songs that were largely forgotten by the mainstream. He loved bringing these songs back to life with his own twist, using his voice and ukulele to create something that was both nostalgic and unique. What started as a personal obsession began to take shape as his life's work. And while other kids his age were chasing the latest trends, Tiny Tim was carving out a space for himself in the music world, one that would forever be remembered for its oddity, its charm, and its brilliance. In his quest to find the right stage name, Tiny Tim tried several identities, but none of them captured the essence of who he was. He experimented with names like Larry Love, Derry Doe, and Sir Timothy Timmins, each of which felt either too forced or too bland. And his painted face made him look like he had stepped out of a different time, a time when the world of music was full of vaudeville acts and Tin Pan Alley tunes. He wasn't just a musician, he was an artist performing in a way no one had ever seen before. Tiny Tim's journey into the spotlight was anything but conventional. His early performances took him to the most unusual venues, where he would hone his craft and attempt to carve out a place for himself in the competitive world of entertainment. One of his earliest gigs took place at Hubert's Museum, a notorious dime museum in Times Square, known for its freak show atmosphere. The museum had been a home to sword swallowers, tattooed ladies, and even a flea circus, a place where oddities and entertainers of all kinds gathered to showcase their talents. It was here, performing among these other strange acts, that Tiny Tim began to stand out. The audience, accustomed to seeing bizarre acts, began to take notice of the tall man with the white face and the falsetto voice. They started calling him the Human Canary, a nickname that stuck due to his high-pitched, unique vocal range. Despite his growing recognition, Tiny Tim faced a difficult challenge, being taken seriously as an artist. To many, he was just a novelty act, a sideshow performer among the freaks and curiosities of New York City. While the audiences in Hubert's Museum and similar venues appreciated his strange talents, it was clear that Tiny Tim's ambitions reached beyond being a spectacle. He wanted to be a real musician, someone who could bring the forgotten songs of the past to a new audience, someone who could captivate the world with his voice and his passion for early American music. But the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. Eventually, Tiny Tim realized that to truly find his place in the world of music, he had to move beyond the confines of Times Square's sideshow world. So, he made his way to Greenwich Village, the cultural heart of New York's counterculture movement. There, he began performing in smaller, more intimate venues, clubs, open mics, and cafes, where the audience was more in tune with the folk scene that was blossoming at the time. But despite his efforts, success didn't come easily. His performances at these venues were often met with confusion and disinterest. The mainstream music world, which was heavily influenced by rock and roll, had no idea what to make of him. His voice, his look, and his old-fashioned music seemed out of place in an era that was obsessed with electric guitars and revolutionary youth culture. However, it was at one particular venue in Greenwich Village where Tiny Tim's true potential started to show. Page 3 was a small, lesbian-run club on 7th Avenue, known for its eclectic mix of artists and performers. Tiny Tim was hired to perform there for a modest pay of $96 a month. It wasn't much, but the club provided him with a real stage, a steady audience, and the opportunity to develop his style. It was here that Tiny Tim began to show the world just how much more he was capable of. He became known for his ability to switch effortlessly between his falsetto and baritone voices, showcasing a vocal range that few could match. His rendition of the song "I Enjoy Being a Girl" became a crowd favorite, and it was at Page 3 where he truly began to transform from a quirky sideshow act into a respected artist. The club's open-minded, accepting atmosphere allowed Tiny Tim to experiment, push boundaries, and perfect his craft in a way he couldn't have done in more traditional settings. Despite these early signs of success, Tiny Tim was still struggling to break through into the mainstream. His odd appearance and unorthodox style kept him on the fringe of the music industry. Yet, the more he performed, the more he refined his identity as an artist. He wasn't just performing songs from the past, he was bringing them back to life in a way that felt fresh and new. His deep knowledge of early American music, combined with his willingness to embrace the eccentricities that made him unique, began to set him apart from the crowd. His journey had just begun, but the seeds of something special were starting to take root. In the coming years, the world would soon see that Tiny Tim was far more than just a novelty act. He was an artist who had found his voice, his stage, and his audience. In February of 1968, Tiny Tim's career took an unexpected turn when he made an unforgettable appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a popular comedy and variety show known for its fast-paced humor and surprise guests. This was no ordinary TV appearance. Tiny Tim, carrying his ukulele and dressed in his usual eccentric attire, stepped onto the stage and began singing "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" in his signature high-pitched falsetto. The audience didn't know what to expect, and neither did the co-hosts. Some people in the crowd laughed, and his painted face made him look like he had stepped out of a different time. A time when the world of music was full of vaudeville acts and Tin Pan Alley tunes. He wasn't just a musician. He was an artist performing in a way no one had ever seen before. Tiny Tim's journey into the spotlight was anything but conventional. His early performances took him to the most unusual venues, where he would hone his craft and attempt to carve out a place for himself in the competitive world of entertainment. One of his earliest gigs took place at Hubert's Museum, a notorious dime museum in Times Square known for its freak show atmosphere. The museum had been a home to sword swallowers, tattooed ladies, and even a flea circus, a place where oddities and entertainers of all kinds gathered to showcase their talents. It was here, performing among these other strange acts, that Tiny Tim began to stand out. The audience, accustomed to seeing bizarre acts, began to take notice of the tall man with the white face and the falsetto voice. They started calling him the Human Canary, a nickname that stuck due to his high-pitched, unique vocal range. Despite his growing recognition, Tiny Tim faced a difficult challenge: being taken seriously as an artist. To many, he was just a novelty act, a sideshow performer among the freaks and curiosities of New York City. While the audiences in Hubert's Museum and similar venues appreciated his strange talents, it was clear that Tiny Tim's ambitions reached beyond being a spectacle. He wanted to be a real musician, someone who could bring the forgotten songs of the past to a new audience, someone who could captivate the world with his voice and his passion for early American music. But the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. Eventually, Tiny Tim realized that to truly find his place in the world of music, he had to move beyond the confines of Times Square's sideshow world. So, he made his way to Greenwich Village, the cultural heart of New York's counterculture movement. There, he began performing in smaller, more intimate venues, clubs, open mics, and cafes, where the audience was more in tune with the folk scene that was blossoming at the time. But despite his efforts, success didn't come easily. His performances at these venues were often met with confusion and disinterest. The mainstream music world, which was heavily influenced by rock and roll, had no idea what to make of him. His voice, his look, and his old-fashioned music seemed out of place in an era that was obsessed with electric guitars and revolutionary youth culture. However, it was at one particular venue in Greenwich Village where Tiny Tim's true potential started to show. Page 3 was a small, lesbian-run club on 7th Avenue, known for its eclectic mix of artists and performers. Tiny Tim was hired to perform there for a modest pay of $96 a month. It wasn't much, but the club provided him with a real stage, a steady audience, and the opportunity to develop his style. It was here that Tiny Tim began to show the world just how much more he was capable of. He became known for his ability to switch effortlessly between his falsetto and baritone voices, showcasing a vocal range that few could match. His rendition of the song, "I Enjoy Being a Girl," became a crowd favorite, and it was at Page 3 where he truly began to transform from a quirky sideshow act into a respected artist. The club's open-minded, accepting atmosphere allowed Tiny Tim to experiment, push boundaries, and perfect his craft in a way he couldn't have done in more traditional settings. Despite these early signs of success, Tiny Tim was still struggling to break through into the mainstream. His odd appearance and unorthodox style kept him on the fringe of the music industry. Yet, the more he performed, the more he refined his identity as an artist. He wasn't just performing songs from the past, he was bringing them back to life in a way that felt fresh and new. His deep knowledge of early American music, combined with his willingness to embrace the eccentricities that made him unique, began to set him apart from the crowd. His journey had just begun, but the seeds of something special were starting to take root. In the coming years, the world would soon see that Tiny Tim was far more than just a novelty act. He was an artist who had found his voice, his stage, and his audience. In February of 1968, Tiny Tim's career took an unexpected turn when he made an unforgettable appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a popular comedy and variety show known for its fast-paced humor and surprise guests. This was no ordinary TV appearance. Tiny Tim, carrying his ukulele and dressed in his usual eccentric attire, stepped onto the stage and began singing "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" in his signature high-pitched falsetto. The audience didn't know what to expect, and neither did the co-hosts. Some people in the crowd laughed, while others sat in stunned silence, unsure how to react to the bizarre performance. But by the end of his song, Tiny Tim had captured the attention of millions. Whether they were laughing at him or simply fascinated by his strange charm, the world was watching. That single performance transformed Tiny Tim from a curious figure in New York's underground music scene into an overnight sensation. His name was suddenly on everyone's lips, and his iconic rendition of "Tiptoe Through the Tulips" became his signature song, forever cementing him as one of the most unique entertainers of his time. What made his appearance so memorable wasn't just his eccentricity. It was the way he turned an old, nostalgic love song into something completely new and unexpected. His voice, with its delicate falsetto, combined with his whimsical personality, brought an old-fashioned tune into the realm of modern pop culture. For many, Tiny Tim represented a return to a bygone era of music, but with a bizarre, modern twist that captured the spirit of the times. The audience wasn't sure whether they were witnessing a genuine musical performance or a comedic novelty act, but by the end of the show, it didn't matter. Tiny Tim had captured the nation's attention, and his unpredictable charm made him the talk of the town. He had arrived, and the world was eager to see what he would do next. Following his breakthrough on Laugh-In, Tiny Tim's success skyrocketed. His appearance led to numerous offers and opportunities, including a recording contract with Reprise Records, a label that was home to some of the biggest names in music, including Frank Sinatra. In 1968, Tiny Tim released his debut album, God Bless Tiny Tim, an eclectic mix of Tin Pan Alley songs, vaudeville tunes, and his own original compositions. The album, with its strange blend of nostalgia and novelty, became a surprise hit. The standout track, of course, was his version of "Tiptoe Through the Tulips," which had already become a national sensation. The album's success was largely driven by Tiny Tim's unique appeal, his ability to breathe new life into songs from an earlier era, while making them his own. The release of God Bless Tiny Tim marked the beginning of his mainstream success. His unmistakable style, his quirky persona, and his love for forgotten music struck a chord with audiences at a time when cultural norms were being challenged and individuality was being celebrated. Tiny Tim's eccentric approach to music, combined with his deep knowledge of early American songs, set him apart from everyone else in the music industry. But it wasn't just his music that made him fascinating. It was the entire package. His unpredictable persona, his larger-than-life personality, and his strange performances captivated the imagination of the public. Tiny Tim's appearances on major television shows, including The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show, introduced him to a broader audience and solidified his place in pop culture history. Each time he stepped onto the stage, he was a mystery. Was he a musical genius or a bizarre novelty act? The lines blurred, and people couldn't stop watching. One of the most iconic moments in Tiny Tim's rise to fame was his repeated appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Tiny Tim became one of Carson's favorite guests, appearing more than 20 times between 1968 and the early 1970s. Carson, who was known for his sharp wit and quick comebacks, seemed genuinely fascinated by Tiny Tim's eccentricities. Unlike many other television hosts who treated unconventional guests like a joke, Carson allowed Tiny Tim to showcase his full range of talents. Whether it was singing a love song from the 1920s, discussing his knowledge of forgotten music, or making bizarre, off-the-cuff comments, Tiny Tim kept audiences on the edge of their seats. He was unpredictable, and that made him endlessly entertaining. The public's curiosity about Tiny Tim only grew as he made more television appearances. It wasn't just about the music, it was about the mystery of Tiny Tim. Was he an artist, or just an eccentric character playing a role? That ambiguity was part of his charm. People loved the spectacle of it all, and they couldn't look away. As his fame grew, so did his presence in the media. He was no longer just a novelty. He was a cultural phenomenon, one that reflected the spirit of the 1960s, a time of change, rebellion, and a thirst for individuality. Tiny Tim's success in the mainstream was as sudden as it was unexpected, but it was clear that he had struck a chord with a generation eager for something different. His ability to mix nostalgia with modern quirkiness made him an undeniable presence in music and television. His performances on Laugh-In and other TV shows, combined with the success of his album God Bless Tiny Tim, solidified his place in pop culture history. And while some still saw him as a joke, others recognized him as a true artist, one who had revived forgotten music and brought it into the cultural conversation in a way that no one else could. With his newfound fame, Tiny Tim was catapulted into the mainstream. His music, his eccentric persona, and his unpredictable performances captured the imagination of a generation. As the 1960s progressed, Tiny Tim's place in popular culture was secure, and the world was eager to see what he would do next. Whether he was a musical genius or simply an oddity, one thing was for sure: Tiny Tim had made an indelible mark on the entertainment world. In December of 1969, Tiny Tim made headlines for something far more personal than his music: his marriage to 17-year-old Victoria, Miss Vicky Budinger. The spectacle was unlike anything the public had ever seen before, as it was broadcast live on The Tonight Show to an audience of 45 million viewers. Tiny Tim, at 37 years old, stood on stage in a Victorian-style suit, holding hands with Miss Vicky in a ceremony that seemed almost too surreal to be real. The moment was an extravagant display, with the set decorated with thousands of Dutch tulips, a nod to Tiny Tim's hit song, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." For many, it was a moment of pure entertainment, a bizarre yet fascinating union that drew intense public attention. Tiny Tim, known for his eccentricities, saw this as his way of solidifying his place in pop culture, positioning himself not just as a novelty, but as a true cultural figure. The wedding was a national event, and the response from viewers was overwhelming. Some were bewildered, others were enthralled, and some simply couldn't look away. Tiny Tim's desire for the world to see him as more than just an oddity was evident in every detail of the wedding. His attempt to create a grand spectacle around such a personal event made it clear that he wanted to be more than a character on television. He wanted to be an icon. The marriage was the culmination of his efforts to secure a place in mainstream culture, but it would also mark the beginning of a turbulent chapter in his personal life. Despite the media frenzy surrounding the wedding, Tiny Tim's marriage to Miss Vicky was fraught with difficulties. Their 20-year age gap caused immediate controversy, with many questioning the nature of their relationship. Miss Vicky later admitted that she had been swept up in the moment and, as a young girl, she had embraced the excitement of the televised wedding. But as time went on, it became clear that they were not on the same page. While Miss Vicky sought stability and a more traditional family life, Tiny Tim remained completely focused on his career, unable to separate his personal life from his need for attention and the public's fascination with his persona. Within 2 years, their relationship was already strained, and by 1977, they officially divorced. Though they had one child together, their brief marriage became one of the many peculiar chapters in Tiny Tim's life. Behind the public persona was a man whose eccentricities were even more peculiar than what was shown on stage. Tiny Tim's obsessive nature extended far beyond his musical performances. One of his most notable traits was his extreme obsession with cleanliness. He showered up to 6 times a day, convinced that hygiene was key to purity and his well-being. This ritual wasn't just a simple habit, it was an obsession. Tiny Tim believed that cleanliness was a necessary part of maintaining his youthful image, and he took it to an extreme that many of his friends and associates found bizarre. He even refused to use regular towels, opting instead for disposable paper towels, believing they were more hygienic. His habits were a reflection of his intense desire to maintain a certain image, one that he believed was essential to his identity as a cultural figure. But cleanliness was just one of his strange habits. Tiny Tim also spent lavishly on cosmetics, not to cover up flaws or age, but because he admired beauty. He would purchase expensive products simply to surround himself with what he considered beautiful objects. This obsession with beauty didn't just stop at his appearance, it permeated every aspect of his life. He would buy cosmetics simply to feel closer to beautiful women, showcasing an almost childlike wonder for things that made him feel pure and aesthetically pleasing. His managers and friends often complained about his reckless spending, calling it childish and impractical, but for Tiny Tim, these purchases were about maintaining the image he wanted the world to see. Tiny Tim's relationship with his image extended to his views on love and commitment. His marriage to Miss Vicky was just one example of his unconventional approach to relationships. On their wedding night, Tiny Tim shocked his new wife by telling her that he still planned to see other women. It was a statement that bewildered Miss Vicky, but for Tiny Tim, this was just another aspect of his refusal to conform to societal norms. He never adhered to traditional expectations of marriage or commitment, instead embracing an open and unconventional view of relationships. His actions often seemed puzzling to those around him, but for him, they were an expression of his individuality and desire to live life on his own terms. His marriages would continue to reflect this nonconformist attitude. After his divorce from Miss Vicky, Tiny Tim married twice more. His second marriage to a woman named Miss John lasted only 6 months before it ended in separation. The brief union was marked by Tiny Tim's unpredictable behavior and reluctance to settle down, issues that had plagued his first marriage as well. His third wife, Susan Marie Gardner, had been a fan of his since she was 12 years old. When they finally met, their relationship started with an awkward question from Tiny Tim. "Do you consider yourself attractive?" Despite the strange beginning, they eventually married in 1995. Though their relationship seemed to have more stability than his previous ones, it was still marked by Tiny Tim's odd habits and refusal to live according to conventional expectations. Tiny Tim's approach to relationships, cleanliness, and spending was always tied to his larger-than-life persona. To him, maintaining his identity was paramount, even if it meant embracing habits and behaviors that most would find strange or even absurd. He refused to conform to the norms of society, choosing instead to live according to his own rules. Whether it was his obsession with purity, his bizarre rituals, or his complicated views on love and commitment, Tiny Tim's personal life was as eccentric as the performances that made him famous. His refusal to adhere to societal standards only added to his mystique, keeping the world fascinated with him long after his mainstream success had waned. As the 1970s unfolded, the music world began to change, and with it, the public's interest in Tiny Tim began to fade. The rise of rock and pop music, led by electrifying performances and the cultural shift toward youth-driven rebellion, pushed the more eccentric and nostalgic sounds of the past to the margins. While Tiny Tim's appeal had been rooted in novelty, the novelty itself began to lose its charm in a world increasingly obsessed with the new and the rebellious. His whimsical falsetto and his revival of early 20th century songs, once seen as a refreshing oddity, were now regarded as outdated in a world of electric guitars, fast beats, and the rise of counterculture icons. Tiny Tim, who had once been an icon on television and in music, found himself struggling to adapt to the shifting tides of popular culture. His unique persona, which had once set him apart, was now increasingly misunderstood. His music, once a breath of fresh air, was now seen by many as a relic of a bygone era, something that didn't quite fit into the new sound of the 1970s. As rock and pop stars dominated the charts, Tiny Tim's quirky appeal began to diminish, and his public appearances became less frequent. The once vibrant excitement surrounding his eccentricity was replaced with indifference as audiences moved on to the next big thing. His place in the entertainment world seemed uncertain, and his career began to spiral downward. The fading interest in his music didn't stop Tiny Tim from trying to keep his career alive. Despite his waning popularity, he refused to give up on his dream of being a successful musician. In the early 1970s, he took matters into his own hands by launching two of his own record labels, Victim Records and Toilet Records. However, neither label made a significant impact, and the albums released under these names failed to capture the attention of the public. Tiny Tim's attempt to regain the spotlight through his own means was met with little success. The music industry had moved on, and his attempts to resurrect his career through these ventures were largely ignored. Yet, even as the mainstream turned its back on him, Tiny Tim never fully retreated from the entertainment world. He continued to perform, but his venues changed drastically. The large stages of television and mainstream music venues were replaced by smaller, more intimate settings. Tiny Tim began performing at punk clubs, community centers, and any other venues that would have him. While his audience was smaller, it was still passionate, often drawn to his eccentricity and the unusual contrast between his delicate falsetto and the hard-edged world of punk music. It was in these underground spaces that Tiny Tim found a new, more niche following, people who appreciated his oddness and saw him as an underground cult figure, rather than just a fading star. Even in these smaller venues, Tiny Tim's performances were unpredictable, much like the man himself. His music, which had once been a bridge to a more innocent, nostalgic era, had now become something else entirely. In the gritty atmosphere of punk clubs, Tiny Tim's unique blend of early 20th century music with modern oddity made him a symbol of nonconformity. He wasn't just a washed-up star, he was a survivor, holding on to his artistic identity in a world that had moved past him. His willingness to perform in these unconventional spaces, far from the glitzy arenas he once inhabited, showed that Tiny Tim wasn't ready to leave the spotlight just yet. While he no longer had the mainstream success he once enjoyed, Tiny Tim's persistence in performing and his willingness to adapt to the times in his own unique way kept him in the public's eye, if only in the margins. His efforts to stay relevant through his own labels and his performances in smaller, more obscure venues reflected his refusal to conform to the changing entertainment landscape. The world may have moved on from his novelty, but Tiny Tim wasn't ready to let go. Even in the decline of his fame, he remained a part of the cultural fabric, a strange, unforgettable figure who, despite all odds, continued to carve out his own path in a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. In the mid-1980s, Tiny Tim's career took another strange and controversial turn. As his popularity continued to wane, he tried to shock the public with the release of a song that would spark outrage. The track, titled "Santa Claus Has Got the AIDS This Year," was a crude and tone-deaf attempt to provoke attention amid the AIDS epidemic, a time when the disease was ravaging communities and the public was deeply affected by its impact. The song was immediately met with backlash, as many saw it as highly insensitive and offensive, particularly given the serious nature of the crisis. Tiny Tim's attempt to stir controversy backfired, and rather than rekindling his fame, it further damaged his reputation. Despite his claims that the song was meant to refer to an appetite-suppressant candy also named AIDS, most people didn't buy the explanation, and Tiny Tim's image became further tarnished. But shock value wasn't the only way Tiny Tim sought to stay relevant. In 1987, he took on a role in the cult slasher film Blood Harvest. In this low-budget movie, Tiny Tim portrayed a creepy ukulele-playing clown named Marvelous Mervo, a character as unsettling as the film itself. The movie, which was panned by critics and failed to gain any significant following at first, only became a cult favorite years later. But Tiny Tim's involvement in Blood Harvest added another layer to his already bizarre career, as it was clear to many that he was no longer the whimsical novelty act he had once been. He was an actor in a film that played to the darker and stranger corners of entertainment. His participation in such an offbeat project only alienated the mainstream audience further, and it seemed like his bizarre decisions had taken him further away from the music world that once embraced him. Despite the controversy surrounding his later projects, Tiny Tim continued to search for a place in the entertainment world, even though mainstream success was now out of reach. In the late 1970s and 1980s, he found a new audience within the punk rock scene. Far from the traditional venues where he had once performed, Tiny Tim discovered a group of fans who were drawn to his eccentricity, his nonconformity, and his outsider status. In the world of punk rock, where rebellion and individualism were celebrated, Tiny Tim's bizarre charm fit right in. He became a figure that resonated with those who saw themselves as outsiders, rejecting the norms of society in much the same way Tiny Tim had done throughout his life. His appeal to the punk community wasn't about nostalgia or whimsy. It was about his refusal to adhere to any conventional standards. Punk rock, with its DIY ethos and penchant for the unconventional, welcomed Tiny Tim as a figure who had lived through the contradictions of fame and rejection. In this subculture, Tiny Tim found a renewed sense of purpose, playing in small clubs and collaborating with bands that shared his irreverence. One of the most notable collaborations came when Tiny Tim worked with the Texas-based polka band Brave Combo. Known for their experimental sound and willingness to blend genres, Brave Combo's work with Tiny Tim was a perfect match, combining the oddity of Tiny Tim's musical style with the band's unique blend of polka, rock, and experimental music. Tiny Tim's appearances with Brave Combo and other similar acts further cemented his place in the underground scene. While he had been forgotten by mainstream audiences, Tiny Tim's bizarre charm and his refusal to conform had found a home in the punk and alternative circles. Though the days of his television appearances and record deals with major labels were behind him, Tiny Tim continued to perform and find fulfillment in the smaller, niche spaces that embraced his individuality. The punk rock scene, ever rebellious and open to all things eccentric, allowed Tiny Tim to remain relevant, albeit in a very different way than he had been during his peak. Despite his many missteps and the fading of his mainstream fame, Tiny Tim's eccentricity never faded. It had found a new home among those who admired him for the very qualities that had once made him a cultural oddity. As Tiny Tim entered his 60s, the toll of his eccentric lifestyle and years of relentless performing began to catch up with him. His health had been in decline for some time, with a combination of heart failure and diabetes contributing to his physical deterioration. Tiny Tim's body, which had once been an instrument of eccentricity and energy, now struggled to keep up with the demands of his career. Despite his failing health, Tiny Tim was unwilling to step away from the stage. His passion for performance had always been a driving force in his life, and he wasn't ready to give it up, even as his body betrayed him. In the summer of 1996, Tiny Tim took the stage for what would become his final performance at the UK Expo in Montague, Massachusetts. At 64 years old, he was still a recognizable figure in the world of ukulele enthusiasts, performing his iconic songs with the same fervor he had decades earlier. But during his set, disaster struck. As he stood before an audience of fans, he suddenly collapsed on stage. The room froze as paramedics rushed to his side and quickly took him to the hospital. Tiny Tim's collapse marked a heartbreaking moment in his career, and the medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize him. It was clear that his health had reached a breaking point, but Tiny Tim's refusal to let go of the stage had led him to push his body to the brink. Despite the warnings from doctors who advised him to take time off and rest, Tiny Tim continued to perform. He was determined to keep going, unwilling to accept the idea of stepping away from the spotlight he had spent his life in. Even as his health worsened, he maintained a deep love for the stage and the connection he had with his audience. The need to perform was ingrained in him. It wasn't just about fame or recognition. For Tiny Tim, performing was an expression of his identity, a way to remain relevant in a world that had changed so much. But his body could no longer keep up, and his physical decline signaled the end of his time as a performer. On November 30th, 1996, Tiny Tim passed away at the age of 64 from cardiac arrest. The news of his death was met with sadness from those who had followed his strange, unique journey through music and entertainment. Though his health had been fragile for years, his passing still shocked many. Tiny Tim had been an enigma to the end, unpredictable, larger than life, and impossible to ignore. His death marked the end of an era in the world of entertainment, but his legacy would not be so easily forgotten. Tiny Tim's place in history was secure, even if his fame had faded in the years before his death. He was remembered as an eccentric performer, a musical historian, and an icon who defied categorization. His contributions to the revival of early American music, his strange but captivating performances, and his undeniable presence in popular culture ensured that his influence would endure long after his passing. Tiny Tim's career, though unconventional and marked by controversy, left an indelible mark on the world of music and entertainment. In the years following his death, Tiny Tim's influence continued to be felt. His songs, particularly "Tiptoe Through the Tulips," became ingrained in the pop culture lexicon, often appearing in films, TV shows, and commercials. The haunting, yet playful melody of his signature song became synonymous with his image: strange, unsettling, and unforgettable. Tiny Tim's bizarre career and unique persona continued to spark discussions about his impact on music, television, and the cultural landscape. He became a symbol of individuality and the power of eccentricity, reminding the world that sometimes being different is what leaves the most lasting impression. Though his mainstream popularity had waned by the time of his death, Tiny Tim's cultural relevance never truly faded. His legacy as a man who brought forgotten music back to life, who turned his oddities into art, and who never stopped performing even as his health failed, remains a testament to his unyielding spirit. Tiny Tim will forever be remembered as one of the most bizarre, fascinating, and unconventional figures in the history of entertainment. His influence on pop culture can still be felt today, and his story is one of perseverance, passion, and the celebration of individuality in an ever-changing world. Tiny Tim's life was a tapestry woven with mystery, brilliance, and an undeniable eccentricity. From his peculiar voice and unique musical style to his outlandish persona, he embodied unpredictability in every aspect of his existence. Tiny Tim wasn't simply a novelty, he was a living testament to the power of embracing one's individuality. His unconventional path was a reminder that sometimes the key to enduring success lies not in fitting in, but in daring to stand apart. Throughout his career, Tiny Tim resurrected long-forgotten tunes from the Roaring '20s, transforming them into something uniquely his own, forever entwining himself with the music of that era. But Tiny Tim's story wasn't just about the music. It was about a man who defied expectations in every way imaginable, whether through his odd personal habits, his unpredictable performances, or his ability to maintain an artistic identity in a constantly changing world. His life and the persona he created blurred the lines between genius and absurdity, between the bizarre and the brilliant. As strange as it was, Tiny Tim's life was a constant reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary people are those who refuse to conform, to be anything other than themselves. His signature song, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips," has remained a cultural touchstone, finding its way into movies, TV shows, and even commercials. Its once sweet melody now evoking a sense of both nostalgia and eeriness. Over time, the song has become a symbol of Tiny Tim's unique legacy, something that can still surprise and captivate decades after his death. The charm that once made his music seem whimsical has gradually shifted into something darker, something haunting. Tiny Tim's musical journey, though unusual, proved that art doesn't have to follow the conventional path to be remembered. His eccentricities, far from being a fleeting curiosity, cemented his place as an iconic figure in pop culture. Even after his passing, Tiny Tim's influence continues to resonate. His story has been one of constant reinvention. Whether he was resurrecting the past or challenging societal norms in his personal life, he remained a figure that demanded attention. His story is one that continues to surprise, provoke, and in many ways inspire, as his impact on entertainment and popular culture refuses to fade. The legacy of Tiny Tim is a testament to the power of the unexpected. And in a world that continues to change, his name remains synonymous with the strange, the unpredictable, and the unforgettable.